beginning of a record starts obviously when an artist records their music, and they'll record their music in either a high-resolution digital file or preferably an analog tape for an analog purist. And then that music will go to a mastering engineer, and the mastering engineer will run that music through their amps and through a cutting lathe, and they'll cut a lacquer. And a lacquer is a sheet of aluminum with a soft substrate on it. And you have a cutting head on this lathe that will cut the grooves into this lacquer, and it will create the physical forms that are ultimately going to reproduce the music when you put the needle in the groove on your turntable. Once a lacquer is cut, that lacquer will come to us and to our electroplating department, and we'll run it through an electroplating process. And there's typically a 3-step process where you take this lacquer, you spray it with a fine coat of silver, and then you put it in a bath of nickel sulfamate, and you run a current through it, and that allows the nickel to be drawn to the lacquer, and you'll create a positive from the negative. So you cut the lacquer, the grooves are indented, it's essentially the female version. You'll create what's called a master, which is a male version, and then from that master you'll make subsequent generations of metal parts that will ultimately find its way into the press. And those stampers will actually go in the press to press a record. So the stampers, the male versions, will have the grooves protruding out, and they're going to press those grooves into the hot vinyl. So once we have those stampers, we're able to make a record, initially a test pressing. And so we'll put the stampers in a press. All of our presses are vintage, hopefully well-maintained presses. They were manufactured in the 60s and 70s. And you have a pressing process where you use steam heat to run steam heat to an extruder, and that will allow you to heat up vinyl pellets. And so it becomes kind of a soft hockey puck. And you concurrent to this, you have a printing process which allows you to print the center labels for the record. The record press will take that hot hockey puck of hot vinyl, grab labels, B and an A label, put them together, move it to the center of the hydraulic press, and in that center of the hydraulic press you have 2 dies with a B side and an A side stamper on them that have the grooves, and it will come down and squish that hot vinyl with a label in it already and mold that hot vinyl into a record. It will then trim off the excess which is squeezed out of the edges, and then it will move forward and drop onto cooling plates where it will cool. Inspectors will collect those records, they'll visually inspect them. We'll have QCs that are following through and kind of every hour listening to records that are coming off the press to make sure that they sound as they should. And then they go into sleeves, then they go to an assembly area where they're assembled with jackets and inserts and download cards, and then shrink wrapped, boxed, and shipped. And in that process, you have a test pressing process where you create a test pressing, you send that to the artist or the label, they'll listen to it, they'll confirm that it sounds as they intend it to sound, and if they're happy with that, then you can use those, those metal parts are good, and you can use those in production to make records. In the dark days, I remember one day there was a Billboard cover, a cover to Billboard magazine, and it had a picture of an old iPod with a tone arm on it, and it said, "The iPod generation discovers vinyl." And that was probably November of '07. And you looked at that and you said, yeah, that's right. I think that can happen. And we were pressing a few records that were kind of relevant to that market, but there wasn't, most artists were not releasing new music for the iPod generation on vinyl, but you started to see it a little bit more and more. So you said, right, if we do this right and we do this well, we can build on this.